Chapter 8. South Australians are very proud that theirs is the only Australian state that never received convicts. What they don't often mention is that it was planned by one. In the early 1890s, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a man of independent means and unsavory inclinations, was in Newgate Prison in London on a charge of abducting a female child for sweaty and nefarious purposes when he hatched the idea to found a colony of free men in Australia. His plan was to sell parcels of land to sober, industrious people, farmers and capitalists, and use the funds raised to pay the passage of laborers to work for them. The laborers would gain ennobling employment. The investors would acquire a workforce and a market. Everyone would benefit. The scheme never worked terribly well in practice, but the result was a new colony, South Australia, and a delightfully planned city, Adelaide. Whereas Canberra is a park, Adelaide is merely full of them. In Canberra, you have the sense of being in a very large green space. You cannot ever quite find your way out of it. In Adelaide, you're indubitably in a city, but with the constant pleasant option of stepping out of it from time to time to get the breath of air in a spacious green setting. Makes all the difference. The city was laid out as two distinct halves facing each other across the green plain of the Torrens River, with each half fully enclosed by parks. On the map, therefore, central Adelaide forms a large, plump, somewhat irregular figure of 8, with parks creating the figure and the two inner halves of the city filling the holes. It works awfully well. I had no special destination in mind, but the next morning as I drove into the city from Tanunda, I passed through North Adelaide, the handsome and prosperous zone inside the top half of the figure 8, spotted an agreeable-looking hotel, and impetuously threw the car at the curb. I was on O'Connell Street in a neighborhood of old, well-preserved buildings with lots of trendy-looking restaurants, pubs and cafes. After Canberra, I wasn't going to let a slice of urban heaven like this slip past. So I procured a room and lost not a moment getting back into the open air. Adelaide is the most overlooked of Australia's principal cities. You could spend weeks in Australia and never suspect it was there, for it rarely makes the news or gets a mention in anyone's conversation. It is to Australia essentially what Australia is to the world, a place pleasantly regarded but far away and seldom thought about. And yet it is unquestionably a lovely city. Everyone is agreed on that, including millions who have never been there. I had been just once myself on a book tour a few months before. What remained from that experience was an impression of physical handsomeness coupled with an oddly pleasant sense of doom on the part of the inhabitants. Remark to anyone in Adelaide that what an agreeable place it is, and you will be told at once with a kind of eager solemnity, "Yes, but it's dying, you know." "Is it?" you say in a tone of polite concern. "Oh yes," confides your informant, nodding with grim satisfaction. Then, if you're very unlucky, the person will tell you all about the collapse of the Bank of South Australia, an event of fiscal carelessness that took years to conclude and is nearly as long as in telling. Adelaide's problem, it appears, is geographical. The city stands on the wrong edge of civilized Australia, far from the vital Asian markets and with nothing on its own doorstep but the great deal of nothing. To the north and west lie a million odd square miles of sealing desert. To the south, nothing but open sea all the way to Antarctica. Only to the east are there any cities, but even Melbourne is 450 miles away and Sydney nearer 1,000. Why would anyone build a factory in Adelaide when it is so far from its markets? It is a reasonable question, but somewhat undermined by the consideration that Perth is even more remote, 1,700 miles more remote in its lonely outpost on the Indian Ocean, yet has a far more vibrant economy. At all events, the bottom line is that Adelaide seems stuck in an unhappy place in every sense of the word. Yet, to the casual observer, it seems quite as affluent as any other big city in Australia, possibly even more so. Its central shopping district is better looking and at least as well used as the equivalent zones in Sydney or Melbourne, and its pubs, restaurants and cafes appear to be as bustling and lively as any entrepreneur could wish. It has an outstanding stock of Victorian buildings and an abundance of parks and comely squares and constant small touches, an ornate lamp post here, a stone lion there, that give it a dash of classiness and respectful venerability that Sydney and Melbourne all too often discarded for the sequined glitter of skyscrapers. It feels rather like an urban version of a gentleman's pub, comfortable, old-fashioned, quietly grand, slightly drowsy by mid-afternoon, redolent of another age. As I strolled downhill along Pennington Gardens, one of the central parks, I became gradually and then overwhelmingly aware of the tide of human activity all moving in a single direction, thousands and thousands of people converging on a stadium in a park. I asked two young men what was going on and was told there was a cricket match between England and Australia at the Oval. What, here in Adelaide today? I said in surprise. He considered the question with the bemusement it merited. Well, either that, he replied dryly, or 30,000 people have made one pretty amazing bloody mistake, wouldn't you say? Then he smiled to show that he wasn't being aggressive or anything. It appeared that he and his partner had stopped for a gallon or two of refreshment en route. Do you know, are there still tickets left? I asked. Nah, mate, sold out, sorry. I nodded and watched them go. That was another very British thing about Australians I'd noticed. They apologized for things that weren't their fault. I found my way along North Terrace, the city's grandest thoroughfare, to the South Australian Museum, a a stately pile devoted to natural and anthropological history. I was interested to see if it displayed a fossil called Sprigina, named for a minor hero of mine called Reginald Sprigg. In 1946, Sprigg, then a young government geologist, was poking around in the blisteringly inhospitable Ediacaran Hills of the Flinders Ranges, some 300 miles north of Adelaide, when he made one of those miraculous discoveries in which Australians' natural history almost impossibly abounds. You will recall from an earlier chapter that case of the strange and long-lost proto-ant Nothomymesia macrops, found unexpectedly at the dusty hamlet in the middle of nowhere. Well, Sprigg's find was in much the same general area and, in its way, no less remarkable. His special moment came when he clambered a few yards up a rocky slope to find a piece of shade and a comfortable rock to lean against to have his lunch. As he sat eating his sandwiches, he idly stretched out a toe and turned over a hunk of sandstone. Sprigg left no informal account of the event, but I think we can safely imagine him pausing in his chewing, pausing for a long moment, mouth slightly open, to stare at what he had just turned over, then slowly creeping nearer to have a closer look. What he had just found, you see, was something that wasn't thought to exist. For almost a century, since the time of Charles Darwin, scientists had been puzzled by an evolutionary anomaly that 600 million years ago, complex life forms of an improbable variety had suddenly burst forth on Earth, the famous Cambrian explosion, but without any evidence of earlier, simpler forms that might have paved the way for such an event. Sprigg had just found that missing link, a piece of rock swimming in delicate Precambrian fossils. He was looking, in effect, at the dawn of visible life, at something no one had ever seen before or ever expected to see. It was a moment of supreme geological significance, and if he had sat anywhere else, anywhere at all in the infinite baking expanse that is the Australian outback, it would not have been made, certainly not then, possibly not ever. That's the thing about Australia, you see. It teems with interesting stuff, but at the same time it's so vast and empty and forbidding that it generally takes a remarkable stroke of luck to find it. Unfortunately, in 1946, the world's scientific community paid little heed to news from Australia, and Sprigg's reports of his finding, duly recorded in the Transactions of the Royal Society of South Australia, languished for 2 decades before their significance became generally appreciated. But never mind, in the end, credit fell where it was due. Sprigg was immortalized with the name of a fossil, and the epoch he uncovered became known as the Ediacaran, after the hills through which he had tramped. Alas, the museum was not open when I passed by, closed for the national holiday, I supposed, and so my hopes of glimpsing the dawn of life were dashed. Wandering on through shady side streets, however, I found a second-hand bookshop open and was happy to take that as a consolation prize. Probably because new books have always been expensive in Australia, the country has outstanding second-hand bookshops. These always have a large section devoted to Australiana, and these sections never fail to amaze me, if only because they show you what the remarkably self-absorbed people the Australians are. I don't mean that as a criticism. If the rest of the world is going to pay them no attention, then they must do it themselves, surely. That seems fair enough to me, but you do find in any trawl through the jumbled stacks the most wondrous titles. One of the first I took down now was called That's Where I Met My Wife, a story of the first swimming pool in the national capital at Canberra. Nearby was a plump volume entitled A Sense of Union, a history of Sydney University Football Club. Beside that was a history of the South Australia Ambulance Service. There were hundreds of titles like this, books about things that could never possibly have been of interest to more than a handful of people. It's quite encouraging that these books exist, but somehow faintly worrying as well. Among them, however, you will often find the most rewarding surprises. This was so now when I took down a photographic history of Surfers Paradise, the famous Queensland beach resort, which caught my eye because I was heading there shortly. The book covered the story of the resort's development from the 1920s, when it was a fly-blown coastal hamlet of neither fame nor consequence, to the early 1970s, when it abruptly burst forth as a kind of Miami Beach of the Southern Hemisphere. What particularly captivated me were the photographs of it during its intermediate phase in the 1940s and 50s, when it was much closer in spirit and appearance to Coney Island or Blackpool. It is odd to be filled with a nostalgic longing for a place you have never known, but I was with Surfers Paradise and its innocent vacations. I gazed enraptured at page after page of crisp black and white photographs showing happy people at play, strolling in happy groups along the esplanade, jitterbugging in dance halls, sitting with drinks at surfside bars. How I envied them their snazzy outfits. I realize I may be in a minority here, but I would give almost anything to live in an age when I could put on two-tone shoes, red socks, a lively cotton shirt with a repeating pattern based on, say, baggage labels, hoist my baggy brown pants to just level with my nipples, drop a felt hat on my head, and have people walking past look at me twice and think, stylish guy. There was something so marvelously innocent, so irretrievably lost about the world back then. You could see it in the easy, confident gait and sun-drenched smiles of the vacationers in every photograph. These people were happy. I don't mean they were happy. They were happy. They were living at a good time in a lucky country and they knew it. They had good jobs, good homes, good families, good prospects, good vacations in cheerful, sunny places. I wouldn't suggest for an instant that Australians are unhappy people now, anything but, in fact, but they don't have the happiness in their faces anymore. They don't have that happiness in their faces anymore. I don't think anybody does. It was, it must be said, an age of the most dazzling primness. In the 1950s, Australia was probably the least confident nation in the English-speaking world. It was so far from everywhere that the authorities didn't seem to know quite what was acceptable, so essentially they played it safe and allowed nothing. One of the photographs in the Surfer's Paradise book showed a souvenir emporium that had a very large billboard on its roof. The ad on the billboard was the famous Coppertone suntan lotion ad, in which a small girl is having her bikini bottom pulled down by an impish puppy, exposing an inch or two of sweet little bottom. And here's the thing. Someone had gotten out a ladder, climbed up with a bucket of paint, and carefully painted the panties over the little girl's crack. Well, can't have people masturbating on the esplanade after all. It wasn't just suntan lotion ads that were censored, but movies, plays, magazines, and books in numbers unbelievable. One thing you won't find much in second-hand Australian bookshops in 1950s or earlier editions of lots of books: Catcher in the Rye, A Farewell to Arms, Animal Farm, Peyton Place, Another Country, Brave New World, and hundreds of others. The reason for this is simple. They were banned. Altogether, at its peak, 5,000 titles were forbidden to be imported into the country. By the 1950s, this had fallen to a couple of hundred, but it still included some extraordinary exclusions. Childbirth Without Pain, for instance, whose unflinching candor in describing where babies come from was considered a little too rich for Australian sensitivities. This was just conventional titles, by the way. The total doesn't include smutty stuff, which was, of course, banned outright. It wasn't just that you couldn't get certain books. You couldn't even find out which ones you couldn't get because the list of proscribed books was itself a secret. It was Adelaide, interestingly, that put an end to all this. For decades, it had been one of the more arrestingly unprogressive of Australian cities. The blame for this can be dropped in a lap of one Sir Thomas Playford, who for 38 years, from the 1930s to the 1960s, was South Australia's Premier or Governor. Playford was a man so parochial that once during a commodities crisis, he suggested that the state might have to import wheat from Australia, and on another occasion remarked to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Adelaide that he couldn't see any point in universities at all. As you can imagine, he did not notably enrich the intellectual vigor of South Australia. Then in 1968, the state elected a useful and charismatic Labor Labour Premier named Don Dustan, and almost at once Adelaide and South Australia underwent a transformation. The city became a haven for artists and intellectuals. The Adelaide Festival blossomed into the nation's preeminent cultural event. Books that were still banned elsewhere in Australia, Portnoy's Complaint and Naked Lunch, for example, were freely available in Adelaide. Nude bathing beaches were allowed. Homosexuality was legalized. For one giddy decade or so, Adelaide was the hippiest city in the country, the San Francisco of the Antitles. In 1979, Dunstan's wife died and he abruptly retired from politics. Adelaide lost its momentum and began a gentle descent into obscurity. The artists and intellectuals drifted away. Even Dunstan moved to Victoria. Under Playford, South Australia had been backward, but interestingly so. Under Dunstan, it was racy and exhilaratingly so. The real problem with Adelaide these days, I suspect, is that it has just stopped being interesting. Still, it's a lovely place for an amble on a summer's day. I made a couple of small purchases in the bookshop, an old hardback called Australian Paradox, which I bought for no more solid reason than that I rather liked the cover and it was attractively priced at $2, and a more recent volume entitled Crocodile Attack in Australia, which was nearly 10 times dearer but had a compensating virtue of containing a great many gruesome anecdotes, then wandered off for a hike through the city's green and commodious parks.